Legend has it that it is at this moment that Marie Antoinette utters the most famous line she never said.
Marie Antoinette did not say, "Let them eat cake." That is a myth. Marie Antoinette, unfortunately, probably never even noticed the poor people of her country long enough to make such a statement.
As the mob of women gathers outside the gates, Louis understands that the revolution can no longer be ignored. It is being brought to his front door. He agrees to sign the Declaration of the Rights of Man, yet the crowd continues to grow throughout the night. By morning, 20,000 people are camped outside the royal palace. To close the centuries of distance between the king and his subjects, the angry mass demands that the king and queen move to Paris. Indecisive as ever, Louis is weak to respond. His hesitation would provoke a fury in the crowd and put the lives of the royal family in grave danger.
When they don't get instant compliance with what they want, it really looks as if they're going to massacre the queen.
A wave of women break into the royal palace screaming for the blood of the queen. They massacre the guards, decapitate them, and impale their heads on pikes.
They were like banshees screaming throughout the palace, "Give me her entrails, give me her head, I want a leg, I want an arm." I think that they had grown so frenzied that if they had encountered her, they probably would have torn her to pieces.
Terrified for her life, Marie escapes to Louis's apartments only moments before the women break into her chambers and tear her bed to shreds. The king and queen are now at the mercy of the mob. And what the mob wants is a little attention from their king.
The only way the women can be pacified is for the royal family to agree to go to Paris, because once they're there in Paris, then they can ultimately be made to do what the people of Paris want.
They march 60,000 strong, leaving Versailles with carts and wagons overflowing with flour from the king's storehouse, flanking the royal carriage all the way to Paris.
Le roi et la reine ont été
The king and queen were forced to go back to Paris with the heads of their guards, who had been massacred in the chateau.
qui avaient été massacrés dans le château.
Their heads had been cut off. This is really a completely unbridled violence.
Dans un déchaînement.
The heads were then made up with makeup and paraded at the head of the cortege, with the king and queen following.
Devant la voiture du roi et de la reine.
The king and queen must make their new home in the Tuileries Palace. They will never see Versailles again.
Once the royal family moves to Paris, they are the prisoners of Paris. They know it, everybody else knows it. There are great limits to what they can do or even dream of doing. They are the prisoners of the capital city, there's no doubt.
Versailles is abandoned, and the assembly moves to Paris. Power is now with the people. France will have democracy, new laws, and a remarkable and unforgiving form of justice will make its debut on the revolutionary stage: the guillotine. May 1791. Nearly 2 years have passed since the royal family and the National Assembly have moved to Paris. Robespierre appears frequently at the Assembly and at the Jacobin Club, a debating society named for the former Jacobin monastery where they gather. Now, words are the very core of the revolution, and Robespierre speaks with an unfailing moral compass. His true north is always the people. He soon earns the nickname, the Incorruptible. France is now a constitutional monarchy, the king forced to share power with the revolutionaries in the Assembly. But it seems Louis's share is growing smaller by the day, as he is forced to sign law after law diminishing his own authority, and that of the other great feudal regime, the Catholic Church. Louis decides the time has come to escape the confines of the new republic and mount a campaign to reclaim his kingdom.
Louis had decided by 1791 that he needed to regain control of his country, and he knew he could only do that with the help of a foreign army. So the idea was to make a break from the Tuileries Palace and to head for the nearest border.
June 21st, 1791. The king and queen disguise themselves as servants and by cover of darkness slip out from under the watchful eye of Paris. They make an ill-planned run for freedom. It is long past midnight when the royal family arrives in the small town of Varennes, some 100 miles east of Paris. They are close to the border of Austria, safety just a few miles away. But their dash to freedom will go no further. Rumors of the royals' journey have preceded them to Varennes. A town official stops the carriage, demanding their passports. The official's suspicions are confirmed. It is the signature of the king himself. The townsman is overcome at the sight of his king. But revolutionary guards nearby show no reverence for the fleeing royals.
He keeps hoping that people will recognize him and there will be a kind of rebellion in his favor. And much to his horror and surprise, they are not ecstatic to recognize him. They see him as escaping, and basically he's arrested and taken back to Paris.
The idea that the monarch had tried to abandon his people was psychologically catastrophic. That event really broke the bond between Louis and his subjects. Now they had not only a king who was superfluous, they had a king who was obviously a traitor as well.
With the royal family official turncoats to the revolution, power shifts from Louis, now a prisoner king, to the revolutionaries at the Assembly. At the very heart of the young revolutionary government is Robespierre. He shines at the podium, calling for liberty, equality, and fraternity. He demands universal suffrage and an end to slavery in the French West Indies. And most passionately, he rails against the death penalty, because in the new age of enlightenment, Robespierre wants to discard all remnants of the medieval past. Europe had inherited a macabre repertoire of execution techniques from the Dark Ages. Unremittingly cruel deaths by drawing and quartering, hanging, drowning, and burning at the stake.
Well, under the old regime, there was a whole panoply of very gruesome punishments, and decapitation was punishment reserved for the nobility. And one of the things that the revolution wanted from the start was to have everybody equal in death. They wanted symbolically to have the same punishment available for anyone.
Despite Robespierre's opposition, a new killing machine takes center stage in Paris. Physician-inventor Joseph Ignace Guillotin devises a ruthless beheading machine, turning old-fashioned decapitation into a humanitarian experience. Dr. Guillotin describes his new device to the Assembly.
The mechanism falls like thunder. The head flies off, blood spurts. The man is no more.
Always a supporter of bloodshed, the journalist Marat prints an enthusiastic rant in his paper, announcing the device's new name, guillotine. It will soon earn a nickname, the National Razor.
The French revolutionaries believe in humane values. They believe that unnecessary suffering should not be caused. And what they like about the guillotine is that it is quick, it's efficient, and as far as we can tell, although no one has returned to tell the tale, it's painless.
The guillotine will silence the revolution's internal enemies, anyone suspected of plotting to return Louis to the throne. But it's the enemies surrounding France that most preoccupy the Assembly. There is a fear that members of the extended royal family who fled to Austria will launch an armed counter-revolution. The Assembly calls for a preemptive attack, a declaration of war on Austria. But Robespierre argues against it.
Robespierre is one of the lonely voices who is opposing war because he thinks the enemy will win. Robespierre is afraid that the country isn't ready, hasn't got an army that would be able to defeat the enemy. The enemy might therefore come in and destroy the revolution.
Robespierre loses the debate. In April 1792, the Assembly declares war on Austria against a country ruled by Marie Antoinette's own family. A nationalist fervor grows. If Austria defeats the revolutionary army, Louis will undoubtedly reclaim his throne. And Marie is suspected of aiding the enemy by corresponding with her relatives in Austria, giving away French troop movements with the stroke of her pen. All the while, the king and queen feign adherence to the revolution.
Louis and Marie Antoinette are playing a double game. They are seeming to go along with the revolution many times, at the same time as they are conspiring against it. They are trying to survive. If you want to be generous, they're survivors, but if you want to be look at it from a revolutionary point of view, is they're liars.
With the French army already suffering huge losses on the border, word reaches Paris that Austria's ally, Prussia, has joined the invasion. The enemy troops are mobilized under the command of the Duke of Brunswick, a Prussian general. Tension pervades the streets of Paris. And then, the newspapers print a letter from the Duke of Brunswick, a manifesto threatening the destruction of Paris if any harm comes to their royal majesties, the king and queen. The misguided threat wildly backfires. August 10th, 1792. 27,000 armed citizens, fueled by indignant rage, head to the Tuileries Palace and fall upon the king's guards in a savage attack. By the end of the day, over 800 from both sides are dead. The king flees to safety in the Assembly, but the monarchy is no more. Louis is officially stripped of his title. The French Republic is born. The blade of the guillotine is christened with the blood of Louis's remaining guards. And Robespierre, once a staunch opponent of the death penalty, has had a change of heart. The birth of the new republic can only begin with the death of a king. Dr. Guillotin's chilling new device hangs over Paris like a warning. The penalty for defying revolutionary law and order. Freshly christened with the blood of the king's guards, it will soon put an end to the king himself. By August 1792, with the king deposed and the royal family secluded in the Temple prison, Robespierre and his Jacobins are locked in a battle with the moderates of the Assembly, the Girondins, for control of the national government. And on the streets of Paris, a new political movement takes hold. As a symbol of their rejection of aristocratic tradition, ordinary citizens refuse to wear the knee breeches or culotte of the aristocrats. They call themselves the sans-culottes, those without knee pants.
The sans-culottes considered themselves the true people of France. They were not the poorest of the poor. They tended to be fairly well-off artisans, shopkeepers, people like that. But they were people who at least claimed to work with their hands. Not wearing the breeches, not wearing the culotte for the sans-culotte was simply symbolism of being not an aristocrat, being an ordinary man of people.
The Sans-Culottes seize control of Paris's city government, while the Jacobins and Girondins steer the rest of the country from the National Assembly, now called the Convention. The Convention struggles with the command of the beleaguered French army, which is swiftly losing ground to Austria and Prussia. While fighting back incursions at the border, the revolutionary government cracks down on enemies within, royalist traitors who might deliver Paris into the hands of the invaders. More than 1,000 people are arrested and herded into prison. Priests, journalists, ordinary men and women. Robespierre concentrates on the internal crisis. But his friend, the Minister of Justice, Georges Danton, motivates men young and old to join the war on the frontier. He is gregarious and loud, everything that Robespierre is not. Soon, Danton's name is heard throughout Paris.
Danton is a bigger-than-life character, a man full of life, full of bombast, tremendous drinker and debaucherer, who, though he's from the educated classes himself, is a guy who, unlike Robespierre, can physically identify with the working people in a way that Robespierre simply cannot.
As the enemy closes in, Danton's fiery rhetoric mobilizes the people, inspiring many to take to the battlefront.
At one of the moments of greatest peril for the revolution, the Austrian and Prussian armies are invading. He gets up in front of the people of Paris and shouts, "De l'audace, encore de l'audace, toujours de l'audace. Et la patrie est sauvée." Boldness, more boldness, forever boldness, and the fatherland is saved. He's really one of the people who manages to rally the country against the invader. It's an extraordinary moment.
With so many able-bodied men leaving for the front, Paris is left defenseless, its jails bursting with political prisoners. An unsettling fear floods the city. The growing mass of prisoners may be impossible to contain. Marat puts out a bloodthirsty call for revolutionary citizens to descend upon the prisons and slaughter all inside.
The foreign armies were advancing on Paris. Had they linked up in Paris with these bitter enemies of the revolutionaries in the prisons, of course, then the results would have been fairly horrific from the standpoint of the people.
In the first week of September, disastrous news arrives from the front. Prussia has taken Verdun, a town on the road to Paris. The enemy is now just miles away. The fear gripping Paris explodes. The Sans-Culottes break into the prisons and unleash a furious assault on the city's inmates. They will leave no traitor alive.
And the Sans-Culottes went to the prisons, particularly the prisons where refractory priests were being held, where nobles were being held, where political prisoners were being held, and they started carrying out their own impromptu trials that were very short and that very often simply ended with slaughter.
Women are raped, brutalized, priests disemboweled, aristocrats hacked to pieces. In a primeval slaughter, more than 1,600 are left dead in a matter of days. When word of the September massacres spreads throughout Europe, enemies of the revolution are sickened. Across the English Channel, the London Times gives voice to the revulsion.
Are these the rights of man? Is this the liberty of human nature? The most savage, four-footed tyrants that range unexplored Africa rise superior to these two-legged Parisian animals.
The revolution has taken an inalterable turn. Even Robespierre understands that things have gone too far, that the people cannot manage the revolution on their own. They need guidance, an iron hand. And with the power of his words, the incorruptible rises to the forefront as the man who will guide the revolution. Robespierre had once pushed for a constitutional monarchy. Now he believes there is no longer room for the king. A momentous decision is made. France will put its own king on trial. With the verdict a foregone conclusion, The only debate left is punishment. The moderates, the Girondins, call for sparing Louis's life, which isolates them in the convention.
The Gironde really crystallized as a faction in the convention over the debate over the king, because while they certainly wanted a republic, they were less sure that the king should actually have to die.
But the Girondins are outnumbered by the Jacobin call for blood.
Why did the Jacobins want to kill the king? I think they wanted to kill the king because, as Robespierre brilliantly said, you have to kill the king so the revolution can live. If the king is right, then the revolution is wrong.
In any system there had ever been, there's only one penalty for treason, and that is death. So in this sense, if the king is guilty of betraying the country in a time of war, then the argument is that he must suffer the death of a traitor.
On January 20th, 1793, Louis XVI is declared guilty. The sentence is read. The king must die. That evening, Louis is briefly reunited with his family. Calm in the face of their tears, he promises to return the next morning to say a final goodbye. He will not. He cannot bear his family's anguish and must not weaken on the way to the guillotine. The next morning, a closed carriage brings Louis to the scaffold. He stoically makes his way to the blade. He attempts to give a speech.
I trust that my death will be for the happiness of my people, but I grieve for France, and I fear that she may suffer the anger of the Lord.
But the guards drown him out with a drum roll. Was king is no more. In the temple prison, Marie hears the cannons fire, heralding the death of her husband. She collapses with despair. The king's blood is spilled. The revolutionaries victorious. But the enemies of the revolution will soon claim a victory of their own. Their target? The man who is calling for so many heads to roll, Jean-Paul Marat. The execution of Louis XVI marks ultimate victory for the revolutionaries. A pivotal moment when a young nation, the French Republic, is literally born in blood. By the end of 1792, the radical Jacobins, believing the young revolution is in danger of being sabotaged by traitors, are steering the revolution with more and more violent means. But the Girondins, representing the people of the French countryside, want to slow the ascending violence for fear it will lead to civil war. Their most vocal opponent, Jean-Paul Marat, strikes back at the Girondins with furious tirades in his newspaper, naming those he believes are plotting against the revolution. Marat, who once called for the execution of 200, now demands 200,000 heads fall.
When you look at Marat's journalism, it's got one basic principle, which is be more extreme than anybody else and call for people to be killed. If you look at Marat's journalism all the time, he's saying, if only we chopped off a few heads, then things will be all right. And when things aren't all right, if only chop off a few more heads, things will be all right. Suddenly, people in Paris begin to massacre people. And Marat is the first to claim credit for that.
But the radical movement hasn't taken hold everywhere. People outside of Paris are furious at the spiraling brutality of the Jacobins and call for an end to the bloodletting. And the message reaches the lovely Charlotte Corday, an unassuming yet determined young woman from the provinces.
Charlotte Corday is an average person in the city of Caen. She's appalled by the killing that's going on there, and she, perhaps rightly, considers Marat one of the chief authors of that. He's been instrumental on the radical side of the revolution. His Ami de Peuple is still calling for heads.
July 13th, 1793. Charlotte Corday arrives in Paris. She knows that the friend of the people has an open-door policy at his home, where he can be found at nearly any hour, soaking in his medicinal bath. Corday comes on the pretense that she carries a list of traitors, those collaborating with foreign armies to put an end to the revolution. Marat asks for the list, promising Corday that the traitors will be guillotined the next day.
Having given him that, she then produces a poignard, a little stiletto, and stabs him in the chest.
The so-called friend of the people dies instantly. The angry voice of his newspaper silenced.
When the revolution turns bloodthirsty, it's very easy to say it's his fault. And that, of course, is what those who hated him or feared him did say, and that's one of the reasons why Charlotte Corday actually murders him in 1793, because she regards him as responsible for many of the bloody atrocities that have actually occurred.
Corday makes no attempt to escape. At her trial, she is unrepentant.
What did you expect to achieve in assassinating Marat?
Peace. Now that he's dead, peace will return to my country.
Charlotte Corday is swiftly executed, and her dream of peace dies along with her. She has killed Marat the man, but she has created Marat the legend. His death most famously depicted by the revolutionary painter Jacques-Louis David.
He became a martyr. He became a kind of almost religious figure that had people offering up prayers that went, "Heart of Jesus, Heart of Marat." He had these scenes at his funeral where the bathtub in which he was murdered was sort of put up on the altar, almost as if it was a kind of crucifix.
If you look at David's painting of Marat's death, Marat's body is draped in precisely the same way as the body of Christ is depicted in classic representations of the Pietà, the descent from the cross. So clearly there's an identification of Marat with Christ, with Marat representing the new kind of God of the radical republic.
Robespierre is envious of the adoration lavished upon Marat, but ever the pragmatist, he turns his attention to pressing matters at hand. Because though Marat is dead, there are still others calling for blood, royal blood. The Conciergerie, death's dark antechamber. 8 months after the execution of her husband, and just days after the killing of Charlotte Corday, Marie Antoinette is jailed here, in a hideous cell, utterly alone.
One of the worst things that happens to Marie after the execution of Louis is her children are ripped away from her. Her children were the most important thing to her. And she knew that her son was going to be subjected to terrible abuse to make him forget that he was ever royal by these revolutionaries. And it turns out she was right. It only took a couple years after her son died of terrible neglect and abuse.
The once vain Marie Antoinette is 38 years old, but the revolution has aged her beyond her years.
Marie-Antoinette avait été une jolie femme.
Marie Antoinette had been a very pretty woman, elegant, until the Revolution. From 1788-89, she got thinner. Her hair went white. She abandoned all her coquetry and her pretty things. She became emaciated. When she arrived for her trial, she was unrecognizable.
On ne la reconnaissait pas.
On October 15th, Marie is put on trial, accused of high treason and depleting the national treasury. The little evidence offered is salacious and vengeful rumor. A final charge is added to the list. She is accused of incest with her son. At this, Marie stands to defend herself.
I appeal to the conscience and feelings of every mother present to declare if there be one amongst you who does not shudder at the idea of such horrors.
And at that moment there was a change in the mood, because all the women felt they were implicated, and they realized they had gone too far with these accusations.
Les accusations.
In a moment of public sympathy, Marie hopes she will be deported to Austria. But her hopes are dashed when the sentence is handed down. She is to meet the same fate as her husband.
Marie Antoinette was, in a sense, doomed from the start. She was the symbol of this Austrian alliance that had proved disastrous for France. She was, along with her husband, a laughingstock because of the apparent sexual failure of their marriage. And she was a symbol of court culture at a time when people were coming to see the court culture itself as something completely corrupt and terrible for the country. So for all of these reasons, she was hated like no queen of France had ever been hated before. She was loathed, she was reviled.
From her cell, Marie writes a final letter, bidding farewell to her children and family, promising to be brave. Her long gray hair is cut in preparation for the blade. Her hands are tightly bound. As she is escorted from the prison gates, she expects a carriage. Instead, there awaits a common criminal's cart.
She hopes when she's taken off to execution that she's going to get the same treatment that the king got, meaning she would be in an enclosed carriage so that the crowd couldn't get her. But they just put her in an open wagon where people would shout all sorts of things, horrible threats at her.
A shadow of the sovereign she once was, Marie Antoinette maintains a queenly dignity as she is paraded through the streets of Paris. Her name and the charges against her are read out. The last Queen of France is dead. Several days later, following countless more executions, a member of the National Convention notes the pointless waste of life as one after another of his colleagues are lost to the guillotine. The revolution is like Saturn, devouring its own children, he says. Danton sniffs.
Revolutions, my friend, shall not be made with rose water.
The bloodshed has only just begun. September 1793. 4 years into the revolution, and France is being torn apart. There is violent insurrection in the provinces, and huge losses in the faltering war against Europe. In one blistering defeat, the British Navy takes the port city of Toulon. Europe is eating away at France's borders.
France is the single largest country in Western Europe. It's the most populous country in Western Europe. It has been the great military power. And of course, when it entered into the revolution, a lot of its traditional enemies and also a lot of its traditional allies thought, aha, this is our chance to, not to carve a piece off of the actual territory of France, but certainly to enrich ourselves at its expense and to weaken it permanently.
France is isolated in the whole of Europe. It's being blockaded by Britain. It's being attacked and invaded by Austria and by Prussia. The people of Paris are seized by a fear that the victory of the counter-revolution will lead to a bloodbath.
Danton and Robespierre, the star orators of the convention, realized that they must boldly strike out